Hey everybody, thank you for being here. Good evening. How are we doing?
Hey, good.
All right, really excited, I can tell. Hey, thank you so much for being here. We are delighted to have with us teaching this course for the next 3 months, Professor Corey Marsh. Before we get going and we bring Corey up, I want to say a few things about him as well as the format for our time together. First of all, I'd like to remind you that this is not a class that meets once a week. We're meeting on the second and fourth Sunday of the month. So you have a week rest in between each session. Secondly, when you came in, you were given 2 sheets of paper. The first paper you were given was a syllabus. Professor Marsh will talk a little bit about this in just a moment as he comes up. You were also given an outline. The outline encompasses the first 2 sessions of us meeting together. The majority of content that you're going to get tonight is going to be on the screens, so make sure to pay attention to that. When you're going through the syllabus, one of the things that you'll notice, the syllabus was written to the men in our School of the Shepherds. It's how we train up lay elders in our church, and we require our lay elders to become men that are competent in handling the Word of God. One of the seminars that they have to take is New Testament Survey. They have to take New Testament Survey 1 and 2. This is really what we're calling New Testament Survey 1. This is going to cover the Gospels and the Acts. You're going to learn quite a bit about the Gospels and the Acts through this seminar. But if you read the syllabus, one of the things that you'll note is there is required reading. Again, this is for the School of the Shepherds only. What's going to happen is Professor Marsh is going to teach for an hour, and then after the conclusion of his teaching, he's going to host a 30-minute Q&A with the School of the Shepherds. That's not going to happen tonight. Tonight is just going to be teaching from Professor Marsh. If you want to participate in the Q&A time after the teaching, you need to do the weekly reading from Jesus in the Gospels and Andreas Kostenberger. This is required for the School of Shepherds. It's not required for all of you, but if you would like to order yourself a copy of this, it's about $24 on Amazon Prime. It's just a great book for Christians to have in their library anyway, as it relates to the Gospels. And Andreas Kostenberger, he's considered one of the leading conservative biblical scholars in the New Testament today, and he is also Professor Marsh's PhD advisor. So Corey will like you very much if you read this book. Let me say a couple things about Corey. I was going to read you the bio of him from his seminary website because it'll embarrass him. So let me do that. Corey Marsh is an associate professor of New Testament at Southern California Seminary. He is also the director of Southern California Seminary Press. He is a committed churchman, and he's passionate about restoring the pastor-scholar role. And he is a 4-time graduate of Southern California Seminary. He has a BA in Biblical Studies, a Master of Arts in Biblical Studies, a Master of Divinity with distinction, and a Master of Theology with academic distinction. And he is currently pursuing his PhD in Biblical Theology at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is also the same seminary that I currently go to. Besides all that, Corey has served in pastoral ministry. He is also a frequent conference speaker and a published author. And his research interests are in the fields of biblical theology, Johannine literature, and hermeneutical theory. He is also a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, the Evangelical Philosophical Society, the Society of Biblical Literature, the Institute for Biblical Research, and the Council on Dispensational Hermeneutics. And he is also a founding member of the Creation Theology Society, as well as the Center of Dispensational Thought. Whew, that's a lot of stuff. All right. Corey is also married to his high school sweetheart, Shannon, and the two of them live in Mission Viejo. Okay, that's what it says on the website. Let me tell you about the real Corey Marsh. In all seriousness, I love Corey. Corey and I have developed a wonderful friendship over the last 2 years, and we have really become dear friends. I'd like to think that I help Corey with his pastoral questions, and Corey helps me with my Greek and dispensational theology questions. He has become a dear friend to me. If you catch him on a Sunday morning at Revolve Bible Church, he does not read from the English Bible. He has his Greek New Testament out, and he makes me very nervous when I'm quoting Greek definitions. And all that, though, what I love most about Corey is he's a pastor scholar. He really, really is committed to precision in biblical studies. He's committed to being a scholar, but he's also got a pastor's heart. He's down to earth. He loves people, and he wants people to know Christ and to grow in the truth. And so, Corey, we are just thrilled that you're here, brother. I've said enough, so it's time that we turn it over to you. You guys can give like a Revolve welcome.
Well, thank you, Pastor Ryan, for that. I hear all that embarrassing stuff on the website that I wrote myself. And I think, I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. Anyways, thank you very much for that very warm introduction. That cut out a lot of stuff that I would have to say. So thank you very much by way of introduction there. That, as you know, I'm Corey Marsh. I'm a professor at SCS. Just a little bit about our seminary, Southern California Seminary. We are located in El Cajon, so East San Diego. And as far as I know, we are the oldest fully accredited conservative, evangelical, even dispensational, that word got thrown out, seminary here on the left coast. We have been there since 1946. That makes us 75 years old. Pretty incredible when you think about it that way. We actually predate the modern state of Israel by a few years. But all the great seminaries that are here at California, whether it's Master's Seminary, Westminster Seminary, Talbot, we're older than all of them. We offer degrees from Associates of Arts in Biblical Studies all the way up to the doctoral level and everything in between. So if anybody ever is interested in Bible college or seminary studies, please talk to me. I'm like a car salesman for SCS. And I don't get paid for that, but I'm very passionate about it. As you heard in my bio, I'm a 4-time graduate of the school itself. So I've been associated with SCS as a student and a professor since 2008. So that's about 12 years now. And I love the school. I'm very passionate about it. So if you have any questions ever, when you see me, don't hesitate to ask anything about the school. I'm more than willing to talk about. Okay, so tonight, this is going to be a very condensed version of what I would teach at the seminary level for Gospels and Acts. I teach 3 New Testament survey courses that take us from Matthew all the way to Revelation. This seminar for the next 3 months, as you heard Pastor Ryan talk about, every 2 weeks, we're going to go through the Gospels and the book of Acts. This is New Testament Survey 1. What you guys are getting is a very, very condensed version of what I would normally teach for 3 hours per session. I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible, but there are going to be some technical things, and don't worry about that. As you heard in my bio, I'm very big on the pastor-scholar role, so I think we should just roll up our sleeves a little bit and not get intimidated when we get into some of the weeds, which will happen tonight with all the historical data. So just bear with it and stick with it, and I think you'll enjoy what you actually learn for tonight in particular. For example, so I was thinking for the last few days before coming here, one of the seminal theologians of the 20th century, love him or hate him, I mean, he's got critics and he's got followers, was a guy named Rudolf Bultmann. German scholar, existentialist, one of the founders of the neo-Orthodox movement, very, very critical of the New Testament. He was riddled with naturalistic assumptions, didn't take the Bible as a whole. He's certainly not evangelical as we would consider ourselves. But he did say something in one of the first lines of his New Testament theology, which came out in the 1950s, 60s, around there. He said this, and I want you to just think about this for a second. He said, the message of Jesus is the great presupposition of New Testament theology. It is not a part of the theology itself. Okay? You hear that, and you're like, whoa, what is he talking about? That the message of Jesus, talk about the gospel, the death and resurrection of Christ, the kingdom of God theme that he was preaching, that is a presupposition in New Testament theology, Bultmann would say, not a part of that theology of itself. Now, I would certainly take issue with that, as I do. In fact, I would agree more with one of his contemporaries, a conservative German scholar named Adolf Schlatter, who said, no, the Gospels are the foundation of New Testament theology. I mean, it's in our New Testament, right? How can we say that the New Testament presupposes that? But there was a couple key ideas that Bultmann had that he was correct on. Like, for example, when you read all of Paul's literature, or Peter's literatures, or the Johannine epistles, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, the death and resurrection of Christ is never proven, it's never explained, it's just assumed, right? So there is some truth to what he said. Well, in that same fashion, and not being a Rudolf Bultmann fan, by the way, just so you know, I am to a point, but he's definitely dangerous. But that particular idea is relevant for tonight because there is a lot within the Gospels that presuppose things that aren't ever explained or proven. And we as Christians just read, we flip open Matthew or Mark and Luke and John, and we just see these things we've gotten used to, but never really considered, hey, where did they come from? Right? For example, if I'm going to read a couple scriptures. If you have your Bibles, and you can flip there quickly enough. If not, don't worry about it. But there are various terms and concepts and institutions that the Gospels and Acts just assume that their readers will know. Flip over in book of Matthew, Gospel of Matthew. We'll do this in order. Matthew 5:20, for example. Very well-known passage in the Sermon on the Mount. Drop down to verse 20 in Matthew chapter 5. For I tell you, Jesus says, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Who are the scribes and who are the Pharisees? We've gotten used to those sort of antagonists to Jesus throughout the Gospels, but they're never ever explained. They're never proven. They're not in the Old Testament. Where did these guys come from? That seem to be the enemies of Christ throughout the Gospels, right? And more so on that, if you were to drop down, things like in verse 20, or where verse 20, but verse 24, starting in verse 23, Jesus says, so if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember your brother has something against you, verse 24, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. So what is this talking about an altar? This is language we use now, kind of like a wedding altar, or maybe you think of an altar like a pulpit. Well, there was an actual real altar in a temple that was standing. What do we do with this as Christians? How do we apply this? How do we compare our righteousness to that of the scribes and Pharisees who don't exist anymore? And how do we leave our gift at the altar of a temple that's no longer there? Where did this temple even come from? Where did these scribes and Pharisees come from? Flip over to continue on to Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1, we read in verse 21, and they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue and was teaching. There's another new word that the New Testament just presupposes. The Gospels presuppose synagogue. Where did these come from? Maybe you never considered there's not a single synagogue in the Old Testament. There was a temple, there was a tabernacle, and then the temple. There was no synagogue, but they're all over the Gospels and Acts. The Gospels are kind of presupposing that us as readers know these things. Continue on to Luke. If you flip all the way to Luke chapter 20. Luke 20, verse 27, we have another one. Luke 20:27, there came to him some Sadducees, those who deny that there is a resurrection. Again, we're introduced to a new group of people, Sadducees, and you see these guys throughout the Gospels. Where did they come from? Finally, go to John chapter 1. Here's one more that we just assume we know, but is nowhere explained. John chapter 1, verse 49. Nathanael answered him, that is Jesus, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Where did rabbis come from? Again, nowhere in the Old Testament. There was priests, there was high priests. Never do you see a rabbi, but they're all over the Gospels. And Jesus constantly called one, and he's talking to rabbis around him. So it seemed to be something, even Paul will say in Acts, that he trained under a Rabbi Gamaliel. But never is it actually explained what this is, right? That is what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, things that are in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, where these institutions developed, that the Gospels themselves assume we know. So if we are going to own our theology, as I like to say at SCS, it's one thing to just adopt, theology from the pulpit, from a wonderful pastor who exposits the word. We also, as individual Christians, we have to roll up our sleeves and own what we believe and why we believe it and know where these things developed, right? So that's exactly what we're going to talk about tonight. It might be a little dry because we're talking historical data, but I will do my best to make it a little exciting because for me, I'm a nerd. This is very exciting. The historical development of things. It's wonderful. So that's a little bit about what tonight. Next week, or in 2 weeks, we're going to actually be in the Gospel of Matthew. So bear with me for tonight. The first page of your notes is all that we're going to cover, or at least I'm going to try to cover. We'll see how far we get. For tonight's agenda, I don't want to spend too much time on it. Pastor Ryan already brought it up. School of the Shepherds, you men here that are training as lay elders, this syllabus was really designed for you. You have reading due for discussions every week. But as Ryan mentioned, that anybody who wants to buy the book, Jesus and the Gospels, and read it yourself, and I highly suggest you do. There's a wonderful text to have in your arsenal in your library. Just came out last year, Jesus and the Gospels. Andreas Kossenberger was mentioned. He's one of the premier New Testament scholars in the world, and I don't get paid anything or anything like that to have it, to recommend his book. Although if he does happen to see this video, then it might make my experience a little bit easier during my dissertation process. But anyways, this really is a fantastic book. So get it on yourself for yourselves. The print is actually very big when you open it up. He wrote this for his college-age children going off to college. He didn't think there was a conservative, good introduction to the Gospels and Acts that can be written for his college-age children. And so in classic Dr. Kostenberger style, even though there's not much jargon, it's large print. Down below, you have wonderful footnotes with resources if you want to get nerdy and track these things down. Outstanding book. But School of the Shepherds, that will be what we discuss. My goal, starting next week, is to lecture for about an hour, and the last half hour to talk about the book, have an open Q&A time. So please get the book. I encourage you to, for everybody here in the room. Also, and I will mention this, and then we'll move on, the description. So I want to do a course overview of the course over here. Do that from the syllabus here. I just want to talk about this seminar description right here. This is a good overview of what I plan to teach for the next 3 months here. One, an overview of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ during his first advent as seen through the synoptic gospels and John. Now there's already kind of a weird word, synoptic gospels. What does that mean? We'll get into that. But we're going to talk about Gospels and John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Special attention is given to the historical, cultural background. A lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight. Although I'm going to continue that every time we get into the Gospels, but we're going to really lay the foundation tonight on the historical background. Distinct purposes and biblical theology of each Gospel, as well as the major teachings and miracles of Jesus. I want you to consider while you're looking at that syllabus, that word biblical theology. That's another word that we kind of just assume we understand what that means. Biblical theology is a specific, distinct discipline apart from systematic theology. Okay, so when we talk a lot of times with theological terms, Christology, soteriology, things like that, the doctrine of Christ, the doctrine of salvation, that isn't systematic theology. We're going to be talking about biblical theology. So that means themes straight from the book itself, not using these big categories. Okay? Number 2. An overview of the birth and growth of the early church and its missionary outreach as revealed in the book of Acts. When I get to the book of Acts, we're going to spend two different sessions on it. We're going to break the book in half. It's going to be fantastic. I mean, that is really where the gospel message spread and the church grew throughout the world. It's the one historical book of a history of the church, if you will, that we have in the New Testament, which is outstanding. So we're going to spend 2 weeks, 2 different sessions on that one. And finally, 3, an analysis and synthesis. Really, synthesis is what we're focusing on this time, synthesis of the relationship between Gospels and the book of Acts, their dispensational uniqueness, and their practical applications for personal life and ministry. So I will do my best to draw applications. How does this make us a better Christian, if you will? Understanding the word afresh, to be better worshipers and glorifiers of God. There's going to be some things that seem a little dry. You just got to bear with me through it. Maybe in 20 or 30 years, it finally starts making sense, and it adds to your spiritual life. Hopefully before then, but we'll see. But I'm going to do my best, right, to draw contemporary applications for us through studying of the Word. As I read there, it's in there in number 3, the dispensational uniqueness. For whatever reason, that wasn't on the summary of this course on the website. I blame your pastor completely for that. I don't know why he didn't put that in there. Maybe he thought I'd scare half of you off if I start talking about dispensationalism. But we are going to get into that. And all that really means, just so you know right now, I was here, for some of you that were here, and I know some of you were, a year ago I had taught a little seminar here on dispensationalism, what that means. But for right now, just so you know, it's just we're taking the Bible literally. That's it. If we tease that out consistently, we're going to come up with certain distinctions, like the distinction between Israel and the church. These are two different peoples of God. They're not the same thing. But we'll get into that as we move along the course. So that's it. And you have the syllabus. I highly recommend the required reading as well. And I attached a bibliography, a very short, synthesized course seminar bibliography at the back. Excellent books. If you ever want to, something that I would entrust to you to be able to pick up and help your understanding of the Word of God. There's a few things on the recommended reading I want to talk about. Really, really good right here. It's Scott Bashore, Visual Outline Charts, the New Testament. It was mentioned that I, as well as being a professor at SCS, I direct our publishing arm, so SCS Press. This was one that we did this last year. Scott Bashore is a professor at Master Seminary, just like Dr. Vargas was here earlier, come from the same school. Fantastic book for any of you guys, lay leaders, or anybody here that wants to teach the Word of God. They're charts. Very, very good, easy to read, synthesized charts of the New Testament if you want to get the movement of the text. This is a really, really good resource to have. That's very helpful. So that's why it's on the recommended reading list. And there is another book you'll see on the recommended reading list, Irving Jensen. That is generally one that I assign at our undergraduate level, not the seminary level, but there are going to be a lot that I'm going to be talking about that comes straight from his book. And it's fantastic. It's a little dated, but it is really good. So I commend those sources to you if you get a chance to pick them up. Okay, so overview of the course, survey method of study. We're going to talk about that right now. And then we're going to get into the historical setting of the New Testament. So here we go. Survey method of study. I want to lay down the foundation here of what this course is. Notice this was New Testament survey, Gospels and Acts, right? I am already making a distinction between a survey course and an analysis course, right? One is more technical and one is more with a scalpel getting into every verse and little passage. A survey is a little bit different. We're doing a broad sweep, okay? So let's talk a little bit more about a survey method style. What exactly does that entail? Well, it's going to start with the 3 basic steps of Bible study. This should help you in your own Bible, in your own study of Scripture and hermeneutics. Observation, interpretation, application. Okay, very, very common. You see this a lot. Observation, interpretation, application. It's got a nice rhythm to it too. Observation, interpretation, application. Those are 3 tried and true steps of Bible study to get a good survey, good overview of what the New Testament or any biblical document is saying. Start one with observation. What does the text say? That is like getting into who wrote the book. Okay, we're starting very, very simple, right? Before we start interpreting what say Matthew says about something, we just want to know, who is this Matthew? What was his circumstance of why he was writing? How does he structure his book? How was the narratives all structured? What's the big paragraph, pericopes about? What are there key words and verbs in these things? Is there a difference between what I'm reading? Is it prose or is it poetry? That is observation. We're just looking at the text as an overview going, before I start trying to interpret this, what am I even dealing with? Is it a newspaper or is it Scripture, right? Second, interpretation. That is when we get into now, what does the text actually mean? And that's when you're doing your interpretive work. Finally, third, application. Well, how does this text affect my life? Now, in my experience as teaching New Testament theology and in ministries and talking to Christians and leading studies, generally what happens as Christians, we start with 2. Actually, we bypass 1 and 2, go directly to 3, and think that we've already done the 2 steps. You know, for example, what is the Great Commission about? And you ask somebody, oh, that means I'm supposed to be a missionary. I'm supposed to be a pastor or whatever it may be. I'm like, no. You've just now applied it. That's different than what does the text mean? What did it mean when Jesus commissioned his 12 disciples? What was the historical background? That type of stuff. Well, in this course, as being a survey of the New Testament, we're going to spend the most time in phase one, which is observation, with, of course, some overlap between the other two. You can't really keep these categories too distinct, but we want to make sure in our minds we have a step process as we go through some of these things that we learn here. I got a couple of good definitions and purpose statements of what a survey method is, because that's what we're doing here for the next 3 months. You're stuck with me, so it's good to know what exactly I'm intending to do here. I like Irving Jensen right here for a definition of a survey method. He says, survey, as applied to the study of the books of the Bible, is an overall view of the book, made from various perspectives. Other names given to this method are synthesis, overview, panoramic study, skyscraper view, which I've never heard anybody say, by the way, but at least we get the idea of what he's saying. It's a bird's eye view, right? We're branching out over the book of Matthew or Mark, right? But we're not going to get into the weeds of every paragraph and every sentence. We're going to just branch out, hit the highlights. What is the purpose of a survey method? I like this one by Gary Gromacki, or Robert Gromacki, excuse me. By the way, these sources are in your bibliography. Excellent resource. He says this: the purpose of a survey method of study, as an introductory discipline, the survey method seeks to lay an adequate foundation for detailed book studies and passage exegesis later on in the experience of the students. Okay, so we're laying down a very introductory, we're just laying down the tracks, okay? Kind of, I don't know if you're like me, when you flip open the Bible, you sort of want to get directly into what I'm reading, that little word, do a word study, here's some cool Greek concept, and try to figure out what that means. But we're branching out, okay? We're going to do something that, we're laying the foundation to be able to do that. And if you're wondering, well, why are we making such a big deal about survey? It's because at the seminary level, and that's what you get with me, I'm a professor, we teach both a survey of New Testament as well as an analysis. In fact, before I was teaching this, your pastor and I got together several months ago, and originally, this was going to be, I don't know if you remember this, an analysis of Romans. That was originally what I was asked to teach. And that's really nerdy. I love it. We spend a lot of time in doctrine and Greek and all this wonderful stuff. And then after the fires cooled down and they realized, well, maybe we should branch this out a little bit more, make it a little bit easier. We decided on a New Testament survey, which is still very, very technical at points, but it's definitely the place to start. Okay, so that is why we're making the distinction between survey method and other forms of Bible study. Moving on, a survey method, really, if you're looking at a survey, it logically precedes analysis, okay? Really, when you lead a life group, any type of Bible group, small group, you want to do a survey, which is why I recommended things like this, like the charts book. This is not technical. This is, these are movements of the text. This is very helpful when you're preaching a sermon, leading a Bible study, a small group, whatever it may be. You want to get the big picture of things. It precedes, logically, analysis. Before you get into the weeds of the text, you want to get in this big overview. So if we're going to look like it's sort of a viticulture, a word picture, survey is like the forest view, which then leads to the analysis, which are the trees in the forest, and then application, which would be like gardening. Irving Jensen says this: a sound starting point is survey, which is viewing the New Testament as a full unit, section by section, and book by book, okay? I want to get this drilled in your head, because when you read scripture and you join Bible study groups or whatever it may be, you should know in your mind, what am I doing? Am I doing an overview, a survey, or am I trying to exposit every verse here or explain every verse? Then you're more in analysis, okay? We need to slow down and do a big overview picture. It should precede any of those technical studies. A lot of bad theology would be corrected if we started with just slowing down and doing an overview of things, right? Robert Gromacki says this, I love this: many graduates of Sunday school know what happened in the New Testament era, but not why those things occurred. Some students may know the meaning of an individual verse or passage, but they are unable to relate it to the theme of the book. A synthesis must precede analysis. Very, very important, okay, that we understand that what the next 3 months is going to entail are high points, just mountain peaks, okay? A lot of wonderful things happen between those mountain peaks, but we can only cover so much. And this should logically precede any type of those very inductive, more technical studies. I mentioned the book. There's Irving Jensen right there. If you get a chance to pick it up, it's fantastic. He's got an Old Testament one as well. But I really like Jensen's survey of the New Testament. I assigned this to my undergrads at Southern California Seminary. He gives us two main reasons why survey method should precede an analytical method. One, to see each part in its intended emphasis. That is to avoid extremes, okay? Very, very important. This is why you want to start with a survey method. And two, to see each part in its relation to other parts, to make sure we have the context of what we are reading when we open the New Testament, or any part of the Bible, really. So, for example, number one, to see each part in its intended emphasis, to avoid extremes. This happens all the time. When you're in Christianity for long enough and you converse with enough Christians, you're going to see an overemphasis of certain things. In my circles, in a conservative evangelical seminary, we have ties to the Institute of Creation Research with Henry Morris, very, very old school, which is excellent, but it's creation theology. Sometimes the extreme with that is to read Genesis as if it only contains Genesis 1 and 2, right? To emphasize just the creation. Not realizing, or completely dismissing, there's 50 chapters to Genesis, and the creation accounts in just the first 2 chapters. You can overemphasize even a good thing like that. There's more to Genesis. There's the calling of Abraham, which would in time lead to the nation of Israel. There's a lot of good stuff in Genesis, not just the creation. So you want to avoid extremes. Number 2, to see each part in its relation to other parts, context. This is why a survey method is so helpful. And we've all done this. We've all been a part of this. We've all heard things like this. I have a very, very bad illustration, very good illustration of a bad thing of why you want to do a survey method to see each part in its relation to other parts, to get context. I don't know if you remember back in the day, you had those Rolodex daily devotional verses. Remember a daily devotional verse, right? And it used to be on a Rolodex. You just pull it, turn it for every day. And I will never forget, I had the one for the day, for that day, that either I had or someone else had. I can't remember exactly who owned it. It probably wasn't me, because I'm not big on those. But somebody I know had it. And the verse for the day was this. Tell me if you know what this is. He said to him, "All these things I will give you if you fall down and worship me." Does that sound familiar? Who said that? Satan said that. To Jesus, no less. And that was the daily devotional for the day, just that verse. Name it and claim it, move on. All right? And you got all these people walking around, Christians no less, that are, commanding people to bow down and worship them. I don't know how it worked, but that is a perfect example to avoid these extremes. That's what happens when you take a verse out of context. A survey method makes sure that we have the context constantly in view. We're starting with the big themes before we get into the verses under them, right? Does that make sense? So now that we move on, that was a survey method versus analytical method. Historical setting of the New Testament. Why does this make sense, or how is this relevant to what we're talking about? Well, as I say up there, I don't think the New Testament can be fully understood apart from its historical context, okay? And when we're talking about context, I'm going to give you something that only comes up at the seminary level, but it should be here at the church level. These two categories, diachronic versus synchronic. Very, very important to know the difference and why both are important. Diachronic, as you can see there, is the way in which something developed over time, okay? Things like we read, like I started off with, the institution of rabbi, synagogue, scribes and Pharisees. Where did these come from? How did they develop? Where also the Gospels just presuppose them. It can go into other doctrines as well. Angelology, the doctrine of angels and demons. Maybe you never thought about it that much, but angels and demons aren't really too big in the Old Testament, but there's an explosion of them in the New Testament. And in the Pauline letters, you don't see too much of that anymore. Like, what happened when Jesus was there, where all the demons are right there? There's these doctrines that developed over time. But in our context here, we're going to be talking about how the Gospels itself, these institutions and the background developed to where Jesus hits the scene and what he's stepping into. That would be a diachronic study. Basically, diachronic, it's the preposition dia versus and chronos, if you want to get into Greek. It's really through time. Okay, so you're developing progress through time. It's a great way to understand that. It's very important to understand when we're studying the New Testament. Also, synchronic. That is the way something is at a fixed moment in time, which is also very important. We're going to start that next week when we get into Matthew. This week is all how things developed over time to get to Matthew. Next week will be, what does the text say? We're just sticking with the text, right? And this branches off into other studies as well, like language studies, linguistics. There's debates whether what's important, how a word developed over time, or what a word meant just when the author used it. These are very, very fascinating debates. But we need to take it out of the linguistic realm and apply it also to historiography, how we understand history. Both categories, very, very important. So, moving on here, I should have some, I thought I was going to have some animations. I don't, so everything's sort of on the text at once. I was going to start with that question for you all. Actually, the answer is not there, so we can still start with it, I guess. Oh, no, the answer is there. Never mind. What does the 400 years of silence refer to? Because now we're going to get into the historical setting of the New Testament, okay? There's a big block of time from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And you hear that word a lot, that phrase, the 400 years of silence. Okay, I'm going to make the case here tonight that God really wasn't silent at all. But when we're generally talking about, when you hear that phrase, 400 years of silence, we're talking about written revelation, okay, inspired scripture. Also known as the Intertestamental Period. Maybe you've heard that phrase, right? That's more of an older phrase, so you know. You don't see too often intertestamental period spoken about too much in scholarship now. That was sort of an old way to consider it. But basically, we're talking about the period between the last of the Old Testament prophets, which in our Protestant Bibles is Malachi, which about 430 BC, to the birth of John the Baptist in Luke chapter 1. That's what we're talking about. What happened in between that time? It was generally referred to intertestamental period time, but nowadays scholars like to refer to it as the Second Temple period. Okay? So when you hear that phrase a lot, Second Temple period, Second Temple literature, it's talking about the same time. The intertestamental period. That period between the Second Temple, Zerubbabel's temple, all the way to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Okay, now of course it extends past a little bit the intertestamental period technically because it goes into the New Testament period by 70 years. But still, it's generally referring to the same thing. So when you see that word, Second Temple period, just know we're talking about that period of literature between the Old and New Testament, part of the Old and into the New. As I have up there, from Zerubbabel's temple, about 516 BC, to the destruction of Herod's temple in AD 70. Of course, this, as I mentioned, the Protestant book order. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Hebrew Tanakh, or what we call the Old Testament. For Jews, it's just the scriptures. They don't have a New Testament, so they don't refer to it as the Old Testament. For them, it's the Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh. The ordering's a little bit different. All the same books, of course, but the ordering's different, where our books end with, our Old Testament ends with the prophet Malachi prophesying this period of silence before a new prophet's going to come crying in the wilderness. The Jewish Bibles, the oldest Jewish manuscripts, end with 2 Chronicles, which is a high point of David. Right? So the ordering is a little bit different. The same books. But for our Protestant Bibles, Malachi is the last of the Old Testament prophets before we get to Matthew. And that's the point that we're really going to be talking about here tonight, was that whole in-between period. Call it Second Temple period because here's some pictures for you. Second Temple, there's two temples in Jerusalem, okay? So when we talk about Second Temple, clearly there was a first temple. What is the first temple? Solomon's temple. Okay? Now, scholars debate on the times of exactly when the building started, but all are in agreement by 586 BC it was destroyed. Okay? And then taken on the Israelites were taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian captivity. Solomon's temple, 960 to 586 BC, roughly about 400 years. Then they're released from captivity, as you can see here, 70 years later, which is the time of the Israelites' captivity in Babylon, under Zerubbabel, under Nehemiah, under Ezra. That starts the Second Temple period, which is going to go all the way into AD 70. I mean, just think about this, how long that is. It's just under, I don't know, I think it's about 400 years, a little under 400 years, 378, something like that. By the time Jesus shows up on the scene, this temple had already been there. It's about 400, but almost 500 years, right? About 400 something years. The temple is already ancient. It's 500 years old by the time he hits the scene, right? But what Herod did was just rebuild and expand on Zerubbabel's temple. Pretty incredible when you think about it. If you're going to say Zerubbabel's temple started here, this is when the Israelites were brought back into Jerusalem, into Israel, from their captivity. They start building, and Herod takes over in 19 BC, starts remodeling for 46 years. We see that in the Gospel of John. And then the temple is destroyed in AD 70. I mean, from this time to that time, and we're going to get into it a little bit more here in a little bit, really the building stopped about 63 AD. There was really only about 6 or 7 years of the temple finally standing that the people of God at the time put all their trust in, this building, if you will, to communicate with God, to commune with God. It became a source of pride, and God just brought it down, after all those hundreds of years, within a 6 or 7 year period, then it's destroyed. I'm going to take a little bit of a comparison here. If we're going to compare the Solomon's temple, the first temple, with the second temple, I mean, you can see some difference right here, right? Solomon's temple, as you can see, is about half the size. Temple, or Herod, I mean, we got to give this guy some type of credit, okay? If you know anything about Herod, he was a disgusting man. He most certainly was. There are records that he died in agony with a bunch of STDs and diseases and all this stuff. He was horrible, okay? He had multiple wives, and he killed his favorite one. If you can imagine that. This guy was a bad dude. All you got to think of is the slaughter of the innocents when he's, taking people to Jerusalem or to Bethlehem to kill the babies, right? All that being said, the guy was a brilliant architect. Okay, and there's actually some dissertations now, finally, thankfully, that have been written on Herod the Great, because there's not too much known about him, other than some Second Temple evidence that we'll get into here in a little bit. But the guy's like a mad genius. His temple was considered one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world. Okay? You look at the difference here. I mean, this right here is an American football field, is what it says, if you can't read that. And there's a size comparison. That's Herod's temple, Solomon's temple here, right? It's an incredible, incredible feat, building feat. Scholars debate in Matthew 4 when Satan brings Jesus up to the pinnacle of the temple and threatens him, tempts him to jump off. I mean, is it here at the high point of the temple proper, or here in the temple court complex? It was most likely here in the corner, because down here was a valley, was a larger drop. But you can get a sort of a view of what we're talking about, how the glory of the temple, how the Jewish population at the time, what they had built under Herod. If you're wondering when this, it's considered one of the most expensive building projects in history, but the glory of the Lord was in the Solomon temple, the Solomonic temple. The difference between the two when it comes down to actual prestige is the inside. That's Solomon's temple up there, and then the whole inner part of the temple was gold. It was all gold. Really, really incredible. And I like some of these pictures because it gives you an idea of what it might look like if we're standing in this would be like the court of the women here, the outer courts of the Herod's temple compared to Solomon's temple above it. The point is these things were being built and expanded on, right? By the time the Gospel of Matthew hits us, Jesus is teaching on the steps of these things, right? So the Old Testament canon was closed after Malachi. 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. It's all the same time period. So whether you're looking at the Hebrew Tanakh, the Old Testament, and you see 2 Chronicles at the end, or the Protestant Bible and it's Malachi, it's the same period. Okay, it's the ordering of the books are different. But here's the thing, all the information that we have about that Second Temple period, the Intertestamental period, if you will, just about all of it, well, actually all of it, is gleaned from non-canonical sources, non-inspired sources, non-biblical books like the Apocrypha, the Dead Sea Scrolls, Philo, Josephus, and various other Greco-Roman writings. These are very, very important for history. If you hear things from a commentary, you're reading things from a commentary, hear something a pastor preaches of this period that you can't find in your Bible, these are the sources they're coming from, okay? Very, very important for the background of the New Testament, okay? They definitely are different than our historical documents in the New Testament because these aren't God-breathed, so they're not infallible. They will have some mistakes, but I could tell you Josephus alone, the majority of the information we have during this intertestamental period comes from Josephus. He's an incredible resource into Jewish life during that period, like the Maccabean revolts and stuff like that. But vital developments took place within this period leading to the Gospels. And here's the meat of what we're going to talk about tonight. right here. On your notes, if you can fill them out, I know there's not too much space for things, but these are the big movements, okay? This is what's leading up to the Gospels, right here. I break it down into 5 periods. Other scholars will have 4. The reason being is that they like to combine these 2 right here, the Maccabean uprising with the Hasmonean statehood. I make them separate because it's only right here. We'll get there, but it's only right here where Israel actually was independent for its entire existence up until 1948. So I break those 2 down. But if we had to talk about the big movements, what was happening during the Second Temple period, this intertestamental period leading to the Gospels, this is it. Now, scholars debate on the actual dates. You know, we could be off by a year or 2 or 10 years, or whatever it may be, but this is the general consensus right here. It's the big movements we're looking at. We're going to start with the Persian period. Some will say the Babylonian period when they're taken into captivity, but I say the Second Temple period should start after the Second Temple was built, which was after the Babylonian captivity. So we're going to start with the Persian period from 536 to BC to 332 BC. That leads us into the Hellenistic period, my favorite period that's up there, just about between that one and the next one. 332 BC to 167 BC. That's with Alexander the Great. And the Hasmonean Maccabean uprising, if you ever hear about the Judas Maccabeus, the Feast of Dedication, Hanukkah, all those things, where did this come from? It's during this period here. The Hasmonean Maccabean uprising in 167 BC to 141 BC. This then takes us to Israel's only independent statehood in antiquity, which was, I'm calling the Hasmonean statehood from 141 BC to 63 BC. Then the Romans get involved. Then we're in the period of the New Testament. Number 5, the Roman period, 63 BC to 70 BC. Incredible, actually. This was all prophesied in the Old Testament, just so you know. If you know your Bibles, in Daniel chapter 7, there's a picture of 4 beasts that were prophesied to come. There was the lion with eagle's wings, which represented Babylon. There was the bear raised up on one side, which was Persia, Persian Media, really. Then there was the leopard with 4 wings, which represented Greece. And then finally an iron teeth with 10 horns, little eyes, which would be Rome. It's pretty incredible that this period, we're looking back now from our perspective, but from Daniel's perspective, and he was in the Babylonian captivity when we wrote this, he prophesied these things to happen. And sure enough, they came to be, just like he prophesied. So much so that critical scholars today believe that Daniel was written after the fact, because it's so on point. But these movements were prophesied, and history has revealed that Daniel was certainly correct. So in the historical setting still talking about the historical setting of the New Testament, starting with the Persian period, 536 to 332 BC. Really incredible. This is where you get this man named Cyrus prophesied, if you know your Old Testaments. Isaiah 44:28, Isaiah 45:1. I'll read them for you. Isaiah 44:28 says, "Who says of Cyrus?" Now, this was written about 150 years before Cyrus, 700 years before Christ. Isaiah 44:28. "Who says of Cyrus? He is my shepherd," God says. "And he shall fulfill all my purposes, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid." Cyrus is who was the leader destroying Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. Okay, the Babylonians were it up until the Persians rose. And Cyrus is more of a diplomatic leader. He allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem. Isaiah 45:1 says, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus." Very interesting in the Hebrew, it's Mashiach. Cyrus, Messiah is Cyrus. He's a typified Jesus, if you will, to come. He releases the Jews back to Israel to rebuild. Zerubbabel then completes the Second Temple in 516 BC. This is the period in Ezra and Nehemiah in your Old Testaments. And then after Nehemiah's death, the function of the governor is now vested in the high priest. Really, really incredible, because before Nehemiah, you don't have a governor over Israel. You know, you have a high priest, you have a king, David or Solomon, or a high priest under them. You never have a governor. You see that development in the end of Nehemiah, where also now he is governing. He's acting as both a high priest and a governor. This is going to have ramifications as the time moves on of who now is leading Israel. This now takes us into the Hellenistic period, 332 BC to 167 BC. I know you hear those dates, and you're like, who cares? Right? It's so old. All of this stuff matters. Not so much the particular dates, but the movements are what's important here, okay? Hellenistic period. By the way, that's the word Greek in Greek, as Hellene. That English translates Greek. So when you see Hellenistic period, think Greek period, Grecian. Okay, if anybody here is named Helen, that comes from the Greek word for Greek. That's where it comes from. Here you have Alexander the Great, probably the greatest military leader in human history, next to Joshua in the Old Testament or possibly David. But what Alexander the Great accomplished under the sovereign providence of God is pretty incredible. He is a necessary, vital piece in history for our New Testaments to come into play. Hundreds of years later. We're in the 300s here, BC. Okay? Alexander himself is prophesied. He's represented by the male goat's horn in Daniel 8. It struck and 4 little horns spread out in different directions. That would be his people under him. But let's just stop for a second and consider what God is doing here with the Grecian period, the Hellenistic period. Alexander the Great, within a 10-year period, pretty much conquers the entire Mediterranean and Eastern world. It is phenomenal what this man accomplished with a 35,000-man army. He defeats what was the biggest empire at the time, which was the Persians. Alexander the Great does this all by the time he was 28, 29, up to his early 30s. This man was tutored by Aristotle himself. Very, very smart. His father, if you ever want to know, in case you're curious, Philip of Macedon, that might sound familiar. In the New Testament, we have a letter to the Philippians named after his father. Macedon, Macedonia, these are actual geographic locations in the New Testament that presupposes. It comes from these guys. Alexander the Great, incredible what he did with an army. His strategy was he wanted to make the world Greek. Okay? And at the time, Greek, when you study New Testament Greek now, you're studying one dialect, what we call Koine Greek. But at the time of Alexander, there were multiple dialects in the Greek language. You're thinking, why does that matter? Well, our New Testaments were written in Greek. The process starts here. When Alexander the Great, when he started thinking, we need to make a Greek culture. Where do we start with the language? Okay? So there's 4 surviving dialects at the time called Attic, Ionic, Doric. There's another one, Mycenaean, I think it was. These are ancient Greek dialects. Alexander said, if we're going to start a Greek culture, we need to have one unified language. And so we called it Koine Greek, common Greek. This will be the Greek of the New Testament. Okay? So to start a culture, you need to have everybody speaking the same language. Incredible what he does. He has this little army that gets bigger and bigger, but they're rapid. It's what Daniel prophesied as the leopard with wings. He's sweeping through the Mediterranean. He's dropping garrison after garrison wherever he goes, and he's changing the names of the cities. Right? His idea was, you know what we'll do is we'll just have, we'll have a garrison of soldiers here, and he commanded the soldiers to breed with the local women, the local populace at the time. So he's going to be breeding Greeks that are going to be speaking the same language as well. It reminds me of, anybody here see My Big Fat Greek Wedding, that movie? Yeah, that's a classic, right? The first one was great. The second one was lame. The first one was awesome. But in that first one, he's got if you've seen the movie, the old man, the main character, her dad, he's like, you need to marry and have Greek baby. That's the whole heritage. That comes from all the way back to Alexander the Great. Let's breed a Greek culture. In fact, and if you ever saw the second one, it's kind of funny. It's the one funny part about the movie. He tries to trace his lineage back to Alexander the Great. But anyways, that's the heritage of this Greek culture, starting with Alexander. He's like, we're going to command our soldiers to breed with the local women, and we're going to just breed a whole Greek culture. And so he's dropping soldiers wherever he's at, forcing this Greek culture, if you will. So his idea here, Greek becomes the lingua franca of the civilized world. Lingua franca is this word meaning a one dialect, a main language, kind of like how English is today. If there was a world language, back then it was Greek, and this is the idea to drop Greek culture wherever he goes over the whole civilized world. Jews then adopt Greek culture. This is going to lead to, when you see in the Gospels, this group called the Hellenists. Who are they? They were Jews who, during the Babylonian captivity, did not come back to Israel. They stayed where they were and just assimilated into the culture. They ended up taking on a Greek culture with Alexander the Great and all his exploits. Incredible stuff when you read about this guy. Josephus tells us a lot. Philo tells us a lot. There's a lot of stuff on Alexander the Great. There's stories about him. I mean, not only would he have his soldiers, breed with the local women, he did it himself. He took on a Babylonian wife as an example. And he would travel from the Mediterranean all the way down through the land of Israel into Egypt and name cities after himself, much like Alexandria, Egypt, which is there today, named after Alexander the Great. He was actually considered an Egyptian pharaoh. Pretty incredible. There's actually no historical evidence from his own writings that he entered Israel, but there's no way he couldn't have, because if you can visualize the world map from the Mediterranean down to Egypt, you got to cross down through Israel. There is evidence, though. Josephus tells us an account, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but let's just take him at his word. He talks about Alexander the Great did come to the land of Israel. And while he was going to Jerusalem to conquer it, to rename it, like he had done this whole time, the high priests knew he was coming, and they all ran out, the whole guard, if you will, to meet him before he came into the city with their Bibles, their Tanakhs, their scroll of Daniel open, saying, "Hey, you were prophesied. We were expecting you to come." And the story goes, Alexander was so honored by that, he left Israel alone and let them to be what they kept them, let them be what they were going to be, and then he moved on and down to Egypt and founded Alexandria, Egypt. Pretty incredible of what this guy was able to accomplish. As I keep saying, by the time he was 32, he died. Some say he was poisoned, but he's dead by 32, and he didn't leave any generals under him. Pretty bad leadership at this point. He doesn't have anybody under him that he's training to take over if he was to die. Of course, with an ego like that, he probably thought he was invincible, didn't think he would die in his early 30s, but he did. So what happens is now this Greek culture, this Greek army, which, by the way, now there are deserters because his soldiers were kind of sick of doing this, just rapidly taking over cities and staying there. They wanted to go home, so he had a lot of deserters. At that point, when he dies, the kingdom gets split up between 4 of his generals. And the 2 most powerful are Ptolemy in Egypt and Seleucus in Central Asia, which would be Syria at the time. And there's constant infighting and warring between these generals, if you can imagine, of course, because they all now want the power of who's going to be the next Alexander the Great. A lot of really interesting stories during this time. There's one actually that Ptolemy invaded Jerusalem on the Sabbath. He takes 120,000 Jews with him to captivity to Alexandria. Philadelphus, his name is Philadelphus II, the second Ptolemy, he would actually free them. A lot of things happened within this time that we just don't have the time to get into, but it's really fascinating. If you ever pick up a book on Greek history, before you do that, actually, I'd say read First Maccabees, which is one of the apocryphal books, but it's pretty incredible. Really interesting, the stories and the history that happens during this time. But what we're getting to is that there's now no longer an Alexander the Great. There are 4 generals that have to do something with his kingdom, and there's constant fighting in between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. There was 2 others as well, but it's really the Ptolemies and the Seleucids that concern us. Well, this is what's going to lead to the 3rd great movement here, leading to the New Testament, the Hasmonean or Maccabean uprising. And that's in 167 BC to 141 BC. As I mentioned earlier, I break up number 3 and number 4. You'll read some scholarly literature that considers the same period, call it the Maccabean Revolt. But I think there's enough reason to break these in half, because number 4 is when Israel was actually independent. Another fascinating period, and we're moving closer to the beginning of the New Testament, as you see, in 167 BC to 141 BC. So the Seleucid king, the most infamous of all, perhaps you've heard of him, Antiochus IV. Antiochus Epiphanes. He named himself that. He thought he was an incarnation of Zeus. So he names himself Epiphanes from 175 to 170 BC. He prohibits Jewish worship. He slaughters Jews. He desolates the temple. He puts a statue of Zeus in the temple. He puts a pig on the altar. This was a type of Antichrist to come When you see, when Jesus says in Matthew, when you see the desolation, the abomination of desolation as read in Daniel, a lot of scholars will say, well, this was already fulfilled in Antiochus. Clearly not, because Jesus was saying it was still going to happen. But he's referring to this, which did happen, sort of as a type, a forecast of what's to come. Antiochus is a horrible, horrible guy. All right? There's accounts of him ordering crucifixion of Jewish women, mothers, in fact, who would circumcise their babies according to Jewish law, their Jewish male babies in accordance to law. Antiochus was trying to stamp out. Imagine an ancient Hitler trying to stamp out Judaism, right? And so the covenant circumcision was massive, obviously, coming from Moses, that one was physically a Jew and converted to a Jew. So Jewish mothers were still circumcising their male children at 8 days old, as they were commanded to. And Antiochus would find that out, find what women did that, crucify them. Horrible, gruesome stories of him actually tying their babies around their necks while they're hanging on crosses. Awful stuff that's in 1 Maccabees, and Josephus talks about it. Incredible stuff. A really, really, really bad guy. He's trying to desolate the temple. He's trying to stamp out Judaism, much like Haman before him in the book of Esther. Well, what happens is there's a revolt. It starts with Mattathias, this aged priest, a Levitical priest. Nobody really knows where he came from. He was from, the record says Medina. Nobody knows exactly where that was, about 20 miles away from Jerusalem, perhaps. But he is a faithful Jew. And he's tired of the stuff that he is watching and Jews just capitulating to this horrible Greek culture. These are still Greeks, by the way, these Seleucids and the Ptolemies. He's actually offered, the priest Matthias, he's offered money. He's offered to take a bribe from the Seleucids saying, hey, if you take this money and sacrifice an animal in the temple or marry a foreign woman, you will now be friend of the king. Friend of the king was an official designation at that point, to be friends of Caesar. Matthias refuses. Another priest, another Jewish male, did not refuse and took the bribe. The bribe and actually goes to sacrifice an animal on the altar. Matthias sees it and is enraged, and much like Phineas in the book of Numbers, actually kills him. This starts an entire revolt, okay? When you hear about the Maccabean revolt, this is where it starts from. He kills this apostate Jew practicing pagan worship. He becomes a leader of the patriotic Jews. They flee to the Judean desert, and now we're introduced for the first time guerrilla warfare in military history. Up until then, if you read your Old Testament, like Jonathan, he would call out to the Philistines. They would meet in the middle. It's at this point where now they're fleeing to caves and doing new tactics in military history to what we call guerrilla warfare. It starts with these Maccabeans. Well, Mattathias' son, Judas Maccabeus, that is where we get the name from. He rises up. He's one of the sons of Mattathias. He establishes this Maccabean Hasmonean dynasty. And at this point, the temple now is rededicated. That is Hanukkah. Okay? When you see in John 10, Jesus is teaching at the feast during the feast of dedication. It's the same feast. It's Hanukkah, you say in Hebrew, but it's also the festival of lights. It's a temple dedication. This starts with Judas Maccabeus. They end up becoming victorious over their enemies, the Seleucids. He establishes the temple, rededicates it again, and that feast is still, as you know, celebrated to this day. There's a story in Maccabees, a story in Josephus as well. Nobody knows if it's true or not. There was a miracle, apparently, if you ever wonder where the menorah comes from, an 8-candle menorah. They lasted 8 days on a little oil, just for enough for light for half a day. And it lasted 8 days miraculously. And so that is why you see this festival of lights. That's why there's an 8-candle menorah to celebrate, to memorialize what happened here. But what's important here is that now there's some major infighting between the brothers. It wasn't just Judas Maccabeus, but also Jonathan and Simon. These are all sons of Mattathias. Mattathias is dead by now. Constant infighting between the brothers. Now Rome is solicited. They're fighting so much over control over Israel and that whole area, they need help. So if you want to know where Rome gets a foothold coming into this area, this is how it happens. They start sending letters to the Roman leaders, Caesar and all the different generals, and they're having convoys back and forth of first the Ptolemies and then the Seleucids at first to bring in Rome, but that also continues out through the brothers Jonathan and Simon, and they want help. Who's going to help us? So they start inviting Rome to be part of their problems. Hey, help us out here. Rome now has a foothold in Israel. This now leads to the Hasmonean statehood. And as I said earlier, it's a very small period of time, from 141 BC to 63 BC. So what is that? About 70 years or so, if that. They have some national independence. This will be the only time Israel is independent up until 1948. They have always been an oppressed, conquered nation. But during this time, Simon's son, so you see the brother is Jonathan and Simon. They were brothers with Judas Maccabeus. They're all sons of Mattathias. Simon's son, John Hyrcanus, very prominent within this period of time. If you read the literature during this time, in Maccabees and Josephus and Philo, from 141 to 63 BC, Hyrcanus now becomes the leader. He's recognized as the high priest. He's also given the title of King of Judea and the surrounding areas. Now you have a high priest who's also acting as king. That had not happened before. The entire dynasty, if you will, the Hasmonean dynasty and the Maccabean dynasty, means the same thing, by the way. When we're talking about Hasmonean or Maccabees, it's the same family. It goes all the way back to an old guy named Hasmon, who was apparently Mattathias' grandfather. But John Hyrcanus is now becoming he becomes the high priest and the king of Judea. And all the surrounding areas, he triples in expansion the leadership, the amount of space and territory that Israel enjoyed. There are stories that John Hyrcanus was a good guy. He was good to his fellow Jews, and Israel at this point becomes a national political entity, if you will, to reckon with. But there are also stories that he was horrible and completely corrupt, and that the faithful Jews at the time couldn't stand him. In fact, if you're familiar with any of the Dead Sea Scroll literature, there's this weird, very fascinating contrast between a teacher of righteousness who is to come, or who may have been there at the time, and a priest of wickedness. Many scholars believe that priest of wickedness was John Hyrcanus. What he does, he wants to actually force people to become Jews. Okay? Forced circumcision, if you will. That's how the territory expands. Okay? They have a brief period of actual independence with political ambitions. Now the faithful Judaism of the day isn't really practiced. It's more about being a political party, a political state, political Judaism, if you will. And there's, of course, a lot of dissension within this particular leadership. But it's pretty incredible because at this point, Hyrcanus, what he's doing is, when I said he's forcing circumcision, this goes out throughout the east and the west, specifically the east and the north and the south and the eastward, ends up hitting the land of Idumea. Idumea is mentioned in Mark. Out of Idumea would come Herod the Great. And Herod the Great is not really a Jew. He, as a child, was forced circumcision under what John Hyrcanus established to force the Jewish culture. All right, so that's why this is important. This is now leading to the most notorious Idumite we know of, which is Herod the Great, which will, of course, be the king when Jesus is born. This then leads us to the Roman period. And this is our fifth great movement, 63 BC to AD 70. Rome has not just a foothold into Israel's problems, as they're constantly being solicited to come help. Rome finally realized, why don't we just take over what's happening? They can't rule themselves. Let's expand our own empire, or at the time, which was a republic. Let's expand our own influence and take over Israel. And that's precisely what happened. After so many times of being invited into Israel's problems, they decided just to take over. Now we're getting into an age that encompasses the New Testament, all the way through AD 70. Okay, so now we're in the world where Jesus shows up. This is what's leading to it. It starts with Pompey, very famous general. He's considered a triumvirate of leadership with Julius Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey. Pompey comes and invades Jerusalem in 63 BC. That ends the Hasmonean dynasty. There's no more Jewish independence. But Rome is very smart. They allow the Jews to continue practicing the religion. They're not going to do the way of the Greeks and force them to stop becoming Jews and force them to not circumcise their babies, which was in accordance with Mosaic law. Rome's strategy was very, very brilliant. They wanted to, I want to use this term because you used it of me earlier, to woo Israel. They wanted to woo people into being Romans, is what they wanted to do. At the time, there was no empire. This is a Roman political statehood. It's a republic, much like America is, at least in theory, right? There was a Senate. There was a collective leadership. It was by the people. There was no empire at this time. That's going to happen directly after this, with Julius Caesar becoming the first emperor. Up until that time, it was a Senate, and very, very attractive. They allowed Jews to remain. Judaism remains a religio licita. Very technical name in Latin. It just means a licensed religion. So instead of trying to get them to stop being Jews, Rome realized, why don't we just kind of have some overview sort of leadership and have checks and balances, but let them still do things according to their own way, which is exactly what you see with Pontius Pilate, with Jesus, and to the Jews coming to him, and he says, why don't you judge them by your own law, right? That's what Rome decided to do. When they took over the Greek culture, and they did, what becomes Greco-Roman culture, they took all the pantheon of the Greek gods, renamed them into Roman gods, and then they got immersed in the culture themselves. In fact, there's even stories of once a year, Rome would actually offer a sacrifice, or the high priest at the time in Judea would offer a sacrifice on behalf of Rome, kind of like a forgiveness of their sins. But Rome realized, they're looking at Yahweh as just one more God to put on their pantheon, right? But they allow Jews to remain Jews. So there's a sort of semblance of independence, but there's really not any independence. Pompey establishes John Hyrcanus II as high priest, but ends Hasmonean monarchy, establishes a semblance of self-rule for Israel under Rome. He then institutes a wealthy Idumean officer loyal to Rome as procurator of Judea. Procurator is a civilian given leadership by Rome, Antipater. From Antipater, he has several sons. The two most notable ones are Herod, which is Herod the Great, and Phasael. Phasael ends up getting killed. Herod the Great is then given rule over Galilee, and now we're in the period of the New Testament, just about leading right up to it. Herod the Great, 37 BC to 4 BC. He's originally given rule over Galilee. Roman Senate then appoints him as king of Judea in 40 BC. Now just consider how corrupt the Jewish religion was at this point. They now have to go to secular pagans for them to appoint who's going to be the high priest, to them who's going to be appointed as king of Israel. Incredibly corrupt. It's almost like when Jesus shows up, he had to come at the exact moment because there couldn't be any more corruption within his people, right? Which leads into why there's an explosion of demons during the Gospels as well. It's like the world couldn't handle one more moment without the Messiah being in it. So he's given rule over Galilee. Roman Senate appoints him as king of Judea, 40 BC. This displaces the Hasmonean dynasty, which was centered in Jerusalem. Now there's no more priestly family. It's all Herod the Great. He appoints who's going to be the priest and the high priest. And under Herod the Great, Herod, as I mentioned earlier, not only was he a brilliant architect, this guy's like an evil genius. He actually has this, he invites Jews in the dispersion, the diaspora, to come to Israel, be a Jew under my leadership. And under Herod the Great's leadership, there's this massive migration of Hellenized Jews, which is why you have the Hellenists in the Gospels. This is where they came from. Since the Babylonian captivity and they were released, they stayed put. And they ended up having lives and children and grandchildren, all that stuff. Under Herod the Great, he says, hey, come to Israel, come to the land of your fathers, and be under my leadership. And what that does is expand his own influence over who he rules over. So there's this massive migration at that point under Herod the Great. And Herod is an Edomite, also Idumean. Edomite traces their lineage back to Esau, Jacob and Esau, also called Edom, Idumean, Edomites, the same interchangeable words. Herod was able to placate both parties, Rome and Jews, because he's technically a Jew because he's circumcised, He was forced to be circumcised when he was a child, but, he's able to placate Jews because he had, under John Hyrcanus' rule hundreds of years later, he was one of those forced converted Jews. But he's also able to placate Rome because Rome's the one who appoints him. Rome's the one who loved his father, Antipater, and put that family in rule over Judea. So Herod really is, as this evil genius, you couldn't have a guy that was more perfect for the role in an evil way, to be able to have the loyalty of Rome and to placate Rome, as well as a whole massive new amount of Jews that are coming there to be under his leadership as Greek Jews. And then he expands Zerubbabel's temple, we saw earlier, the greatest building project in the ancient world. We're going to end as this final period here, the Roman period. Herod's temple construction had been going on for 46 years by the time of Jesus' ministry. We see that in John chapter 2. Jesus is talking about, in 3 days I will destroy this temple, and he meant his body. And they're like, hey, it took us 46 years to build this temple. They're talking about the expansion that was still happening at that point. It wasn't completable until AD 64, and then destroyed in AD 70. So it had a short, I said 9 years earlier, 6 years of standing, finally completed after all those hundreds of years, through all that corruption, and then God just brought it down. It's incredible. Josephus estimates the temple treasury was valued at 10,000 talents. A talent, that's something you see in the New Testament, it's about 75 pounds worth of gold or silver. So in today's figures, that would be about over $1.5 billion in today's currency. I love this one source here, how he describes the building of the temple and what Herod did. 1,000 vehicles transported the stone, 1,000 priests supervised the work, and 10,000 skilled laborers wrought wonders in the costly materials built of marble and gold. The house of worship itself probably surpassed any of the architectural marvels of that or any day. Certainly Rome and Greece and Egypt had nothing to compare with it, and a Jewish proverb kept alive their tradition. He that has not seen the temple of Herod has never known what beauty is. The land of Israel took such massive pride in the temple complex, right? This is just one major distinction between the church and Israel. Okay, Judaism, we can, like just about all the religions in the world, just about, you can track to a central location, and it stays there, basically. There's still the main hub there, where Christianity is a global expansion, right? We are now the temple. The Holy Spirit indwells us, corporately as well as individually. But at the time, if you're thinking your theology is we need to house God and have him with us, you're going to end up building something incredibly ornate like this. The Western Wall, I know many of you have gone to Israel. Ryan leads tours there. I know some of you have seen this. Really, really incredible. These stones, to this day, scholars don't know how exactly Herod was able to have some of these stones even moved, right? Down here are the major foundation stones, which would have been part of the original temple leading up to here. You can see from here on, this is the medieval time here, the bricks are different in look, but some of these stones were 20 tons, 40,000 pounds. It really is an incredible building feat what he had, and the pride that Jews had in their temple. This is why there's so much temple language in the New Testament, right? Josephus tells us, there's an incredible story that Josephus gives us, that Jews were constantly offering gold to the temple, so it never really ended completion. So around this area right here, the main door to the temple, right here, there were these, what Josephus says, golden grape clusters, a vine, if you will, which always represented Israel. They were constantly adding to them, kind of like their offerings, if you will. And these clusters, from what Josephus tells us, was the size of a man. They were huge, overlaying the entire temple door there. Really, 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 really incredible that he was able to build this on the backs of slaves, really. If you're wondering that stone inscription that was found from Herod's temple, it reads, "No foreigner is to enter within the forecourt around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his subsequent death." That's what it says there on the side, which was discovered not too long ago. But this is the world, right? That this is the temple, this is the world, this is the ideology of the day that the New Testament just presupposes. This was their hope. And it's remarkable, especially when I like that right corner picture. I mean, how incredible it must have looked and been. And there were 3 pilgrimages that Jews had to make to Jerusalem to be here at the temple. It's a major deal. Major, major deal. And if you're wondering, okay, I get it. Why is this such a major deal? Because something happens, it's not there, and we're introduced to something else in the New Testament in its place. But to continue on with the Roman period, after Herod the Great died in 4 BC, Rome is divided, the province into three tetrarchies, what it's called, ruled by his sons, Archelaus in Judea. He lasts just a short amount of time. He was a horrible leader. Tradition says he got banished and he killed himself. He's the Herod. Herod, by the way, was a title after Herod the Great, much like Caesar. So all these guys, Archelaus, Antipas, Philip, these are Herods, the Herodian dynasty. Archelaus is in the very beginning of Jesus' birth. It says that when Mary and Joseph were warned to stay in Egypt, and afterwards they were able to come back to the land of Israel, they were warned again to stay out of Jerusalem until Herod was gone, which was Archelaus. Herod Antipas, which is the most prominent Herod in the Gospels, this is the Herod Antipas who was ruling during Jesus' public ministry. So when Jesus refers to Herod that fox, and all these, and people are coming from Jerusalem under Herod's authority, it's Antipas. He was given Galilee and Perea, and Herod Philip, Trachonitis, and 2 other areas. All 3 of these Herods are mentioned in the New Testament. This is where they came out of. After Archelaus is banished in 86, that is the year 6, right, AD, he's replaced by a Roman prefix. Thinking, okay, there was procurators before, which were civilians like Antipater, put into authority. Now prefects are actual military leaders that Rome installs. There are several prefects. The 5th prefix is Pontius Pilate, who we are very familiar with in the Gospels, right? A lot of stories about him. Even Josephus gives us horrible stories about how this guy was. But interesting thing, he was part of a plot to kill Caesar at the time. He had one friend in the court of Caesar. That friend was found out. And shortly after that, Pontius Pilate was found out, and he kind of just fades off into history. Probably got killed or killed himself. He's the prefect in charge over Jesus' crucifixion. And after Pilate's removed, Rome assigns both kings and procurators over the assigned Herodian territories. And we see this throughout Acts when we get there. In AD 37, Emperor Caligula, who would one day in the 40s banish all Jews, made Agrippa I king, that's Acts 12. In AD 44, Emperor Claudius resorted to procurators. Now he's going back to civilians with authority because the prefects weren't working out well. And 2 of those are Felix and Festus, who then appointed Agrippa II king in AD 53. And we see that in Acts 23. Agrippa I was the grandson of Herod the Great. Agrippa II is the great-grandson. And if you're thinking like, well, this is just a mess, and I'd say it is. It's kind of confusing. Because what was happening is Rome is going, we need some type of leadership over these people. So we're going to have procurators. That doesn't work out. So let's have them be their own kings. That doesn't work out. Let's establish prefects. That doesn't work out. Let's go back to them having kings. We'll call them kings. Back and forth, back and forth. This is the world that Jesus steps into. Total chaos. And it makes sense why most of the Jews rejected Jesus as the Messiah. Because they were expecting a political leader to give peace all the way out through the land. Going back to John Hyrcanus, going back to the Maccabean period. You know, the Jews at this time were not familiar with the Old Testament anymore. The Old Testament was dust. What they were familiar with is this period in intertestamental, Second Temple period, all these traditions that happened, right? So Jesus shows up on the scene. They're expecting a political leader to take the place of Mattathias and Maccabeus, right? Which is why you read passages in the Gospels that Jesus refused to be taken by force because of these very reasons. They had a totally misguided view of who the Messiah was to be. So we are ending, okay? So, and some of you are like, yes, all right, I get it. All of that was to get to this. All right, during the intertestamental or Second Temple period, several major developments took place germane to the New Testament history. All of this is presupposed in the Gospels when we get to Matthew and Mark and Luke and John. Just consider this, the diaspora, the dispersion, okay? In John, Jesus saying he's going to go, and the Pharisees go, where's he going to go? To the dispersion to teach the Greeks? This is what's being referred to. People that were in captivity in Babylon hundreds of years later stayed there. They didn't go back to Jerusalem. They stayed and just immersed themselves in the Greek culture. The diaspora happened. Most Jews remained in Persia, Greece, and finally the Roman Empire. They eventually became immersed in Hellenized Greco-Roman culture. The Septuagint, I didn't mention this, but this is probably the most massive thing. LXS, that's the Latin Septuagint, means 70. This is the Bible of Jesus' day. It's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, I mentioned his name earlier. He's the one that commissioned 70, technically probably 72. Comes from one document or two, a letter of Aristeas and a document from Philo. Probably 72 Jews translated the Old Testament into Greek, Koine Greek, that Alexander the Great had started, right? This is the Bible of the New Testament. 1 to 10 times, this is what's quoted by the New Testament over the Hebrew, meaning there are 30 Old Testament quotations in the New Testament, quoting the Old Testament that are Hebrew. There are 300 Old Testament quotations in the New Testament that come from the Septuagint. That was the Greek Bible, that was the Bible of the day. Very, very important, going back to Alexander the Great starting that language. It's the most quoted version by New Testament authors. Scribes and rabbis, we talked about that earlier. Where did they come from? They were protectors of the Jewish religion during that whole Hellenized period. They refused to succumb to the Seleucid pressure and persecution. So they started their own sort of conservative group within those oppressors that were happening, all of the oppressions that were happening to them. Out of that time comes scribes who would write the law. Pharisees were the ones that protected the law. Scribes were the ones actually writing it down. And rabbis to teach them. When Jesus is called a rabbi, this is something that was instituted during this Second Temple Intertestamental period that happened during this. Synagogue, when I mentioned earlier, why was I emphasizing the temple so much? After the temple is destroyed, there's no one centralized location for the Jewish religion, for monotheism anymore, for Yahweh. They become synagogues. This happened during the Babylonian captivity, and it continued. Very, very prominent within the diaspora, the dispersed Jews. Became the all-encompassing way of life by first century. I want you to get that. The synagogue to the Jew is not like church to the Christian. Although it should be, really, when you think about it. All right? For the synagogue for the Jew was their entire life. If you were excommunicated, which you see in John chapter 9 with the blind man, and his parents that were afraid of being cast out of the synagogue, that was your relatives turned their back on you. You were cast out of the entire community. It wasn't just going to Sabbath, going to church or synagogue on the Sabbath. It was your entire way of life. Alfred Edersheim tells us during this time when Jesus was there, synagogues were so prominent, they put poles up on their roof to see which one was taller, and it was on every sort of street corner, if you will. That was the way. There was no more temple to offer sacrifices anymore. All right? So synagogues happened during the Babylonian captivity, and they stayed doing that all the way through the destruction of the temple. Pharisees, they were conservative. We probably would have liked them at first. They were the conservative ones. They were the ones trying to protect the Mosaic law during all that craziness between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. They're conservative. Pharisees just mean separate ones, is what that means. They were established during the Maccabean period, rejected all Hellenized culture. They became the dominant force among the people in first century Judaism. Unfortunately, it's really the Pharisees who become Jesus' greatest antagonizers, right? But they were originally good guys. Sadducees, you also see throughout the Gospels, they developed during this time. They were originally a reaction to the Pharisees. Sadducees were more what we would call liberal. Pharisees were more conservative. Sadducees only took the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Pentateuch, and they discarded the rest. Pharisees took the entire Hebrew Scriptures, the entire Old Testament, as God's Word. And they also didn't believe in certain doctrines, like angels and resurrection, while the Pharisees did. You see that when Paul in Acts is trying to address the mob. They arose during this time. The Sanhedrin, you see in the Gospels, means great court. or council. So tribunal and political body with high priest as the head. You see these institutions and these ideas and these institutions and these words throughout the Gospels, but they're never fully explained. This is where they came out of, that whole intertestamental period, that whole Second Temple period. And so, I'll close on this. In light of that, I ask you, during all that took place, during this 400-year period, was God really silent? No, right? I mean, that's the common sense answer. Now, we're going to say God is silent when it came to Revelation, sure. But he was moving nations providentially in history. He was birthing a guy like Alexander the Great to start a Lingua Franca that the New Testament would later be written in. You know, he was bringing things around, and even through the corruption of the Maccabean and the Hasmonean dynasty. So Herod would come in and be part of prophecy and where Jesus would be born. All of that had to happen during this time for Rome to get involved to fulfill scriptures in Daniel. It's incredible. God was certainly not silent, right? So when you hear about the silent years, you have everything in your mind. God is never silent. Right? He's always working in providence, even if he didn't give them inspired revelation during that time. Okay, well, we're going to end on that because that's a lot of dry historical information, I know. Next week, we're going to get into the Gospel of Matthew and just hit the high points of it. But all of this is very important leading to the New Testament, and I hope you're able to gain some type of insight when you crack open Matthew now and you see these words like rabbis and synagogues and Pharisees. Hey, I remember that crazy guy Corey mentioned something about them being instituted during this time. You can always go back to this video, hopefully, and be able to get instructed in that. So thank you very much. That's it for the night. All right, you guys. Oh, I will, if there's any questions, I don't know if you have any questions, I'm here available to answer. If not, then I guess we'll call it a night.
Corey will be up front if you guys want to ask questions. Now you learned everything you didn't know you wanted to know.
Exactly.